Okay, so this is the fifth lecture on the topic of middle childhood, and I want to talk about the last slide covering material from the cognitive chapter. And then I'm going to stop after this and pick up the topic of personality in the next one. So I want to take issue with a couple things that are discussed in this slide. So this part of the chapter is talking about children with learning problems, and it defines intellectual disability as a child who or as a person who has a significant cognitive impairment, right, which would impair their cognitive or their intellectual capacity. It suggests that the two most common learning disabilities are dyslexia and attention ADHD. In much of the literature that I read about diversity, and specifically I have created an assignment where he talks about something called neurodiversity. There is distaste or disuse of this term disability with rather attention to like learning differences. In the video that I have that goes with this particular part of the chapter, he uses the term diversity, neurodiversity, and suggests that it's not, that this emphasis on disability is not advantageous for the child. It suggests that there's only one way for the brain to be. So I just want to sort of emphasize that. Furthermore, the two common learning disabilities that are discussed in your chapter is dyslexia and ADHD. Dyslexia, interestingly enough, is something that is described along this continuum, and we commonly think of it as people who get the words out of place, but in fact, it is a language or it's a cognitive processing issue. And according to the video, that probably 1 in 5 people have it. It's very common, but it has to do with which part of the brain is engaged in the processing of language. So most fundamentally, so again, your textbook says it's a developmental learning disorder. It's developmental because it's not something, it's something that you're born with, and it does appear to run in families. It is implicated in language, so those two things sort of go together. To suggest, though, it's disordered would suggest that something is broken, and I'm going to suggest that this is simply a different way. This is what neurodiversity. It's just a different way that people's brains work. It can be problematic and maladaptive because what dyslexics do is they read more slowly because they effectively have to recode. They have to decode words, and this slows them down. So that would be an example of maybe something that's maladaptive or makes it difficult for you to keep up with your peers. But it is apparently something that we can learn to overcome. The same thing with ADHD, or attention deficit. It's defined as, your textbook defines it as chronic persistent inattention, distractibility, impulsivity, low tolerance for frustration. But there are critics of the whole concept that suggests that children are not any more they don't have any more ADHD or any more chronic impulsivity than ever, but what's happened is our culture has changed, and so these normally restless kids would have been given more time outside. They wouldn't have been asked to sit down at a desk so much. They wouldn't have had to stare at a computer. So I just want to offer these different ways of thinking. Again, your textbook calls them learning disabilities, so for those purposes, understand them as recognized learning disabilities, but consider that there's other ways of conceptualizing both of these, that we don't necessarily have to conceptualize them as disorders as much as differences, and think of them potentially as culture has changed in a way that has resulted in these sort of differences. Okay, there's also a discussion that, again, I think this is interesting, that they're putting a discussion about gifted children in under the subtext or under the part of the text called learning problems. It is true that gifted children fall under, at least schools in Kansas, they fall under the special education. They do get special educational services, and it is probably true that teachers have more difficulty keeping gifted students engaged so they fall under this category. We're going to define gifted kids as children who have these innate gifts, often creativity, or what's called convergent thinking, that children are, that they're cognitively at a different level than their peers are, and they have they're better able at recognizing multiple solutions to a problem. They can arrive at divergent thinking, and the two most common approaches for dealing with children with innate gifts, and maybe that's another thing we should be using, is changing our language, are enrichment programs where they have additional options available to children in the educational system, or acceleration programs where they move children ahead. There is reference to, I always think of Sheldon Cooper. I don't know if you watch a lot of TV, but young Sheldon, he is in an accelerated program. And there's one really great episode where he says, I might be 12 years old and in college, but I'm still a little boy. And it does speak to some of the risks associated with these acceleration programs, because when you take a child who's still like a 10-year-old child and you put them in college, I know that's an extreme case, but I can think of one student I know in particular. He's 15 years old, and his school was suggesting that he go to college, and he said, I don't want to be in college at 16 years old. So the data suggests that as long as we're not moving kids like 2 years ahead in an acceleration program, that's what I'm trying to say, is acceleration programs, there are social and emotional consequences, because again, school is not just about reading, writing, and arithmetic, it's also social and emotional adjustment. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this part of the chapter up on cognitive, and come back and talk a little bit more about personality development.